Amen. Here's my beginning joke. I'll read it for you. Without my glasses, I couldn't read it from about 2 pews back. These are the re-gifts of the Magi. He's going to flip over this French toast maker, not as much as he will when he sees this bird clock, and wait until he gets a load of this state-of-the-art shoe polisher. Seems like a strange story to read actually before Christmas. But the unstoppable force of refugees fleeing to Europe, to America, and actually to all sorts of places across the globe. Basically, many nations are saying there's no room in the inn. There's no vacancy. All the rooms are taken at Motel 6. Migrants, refugees should be kept down in order to what? Preserve jobs, to preserve our health care, and to preserve our welfare services. There's clearly an attitude of, I am not sharing my resources, which potentially at our budget meeting today, we will find out that we aren't sharing our resources well. But there's clearly an attitude of, I am not going to share my resources, and that seems rather global right now. And we are living our lives from a place of scarcity rather than abundance. In the spirit of Pastor Susan's message last week, did we learn everything we were supposed to learn in kindergarten? Maybe we didn't learn how to share. And Frank states, or actually, I changed this quote, Gandhi says, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. Advent, Christmas, the narrative of no room in the inn. Countries, citizens of this world continue to make decisions about whether and how to accept refugees from Syria, from Mexico, from Haiti, from the Congo, from the Ukraine, from Burma, from Guatemala and El Salvador and Russia, and the list goes on and on. And I am certain that refugees from all of these countries wish they could stay in their own country and in their homes surrounded by family and by friends and in a culture they know and they love. But so many have to make that horrible choice, that awful choice and harrowing choice really to cross perilous seas, hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles on foot, in boats, in crowded buses, to live in refugee camps, to be uprooted from what they know and from what they love, than to stay where their children may not survive another day. Did you realize I love statistics? And I try not to share my love of statistics too much with you because I know not everybody loves statistics. But to be very honest, I don't say the T name very often. Today I'm going to say it twice because I'm tired. I'm really tired of not calling it out. Did you realize over 80% of white evangelical Americans voted to elect a president who wants to keep refugees out of the United States? Much of his platform was based on that. And last week, the Trump administration announced a proposed refugee resettlement ceiling 18,000 for the fiscal year 2020. And by the way, that is a 40% cut from last year's number, amidst what we're finding is the largest global crisis in record history. There are nearly 26 million refugees worldwide, 26 million. And according to international law that, by the way, we as a nation accept, refugees have a right to be protected by the country in which they seek asylum and cannot be forced to return to their own home. That's an international law. This is an issue of God's justice, folks. Wednesday, December 18th, this coming Wednesday, is International Migrants Day, observed by the United Nations General Assembly. So I would ask, how did Jesus' family identify? Were they internally displaced persons? Were they refugees? Were they migrants? How did they identify? Actually, as we will see, Jesus' family, the Holy Family, fits two categories. According to those accepted definitions, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus were refugees, as you heard the story today. They were refugees fleeing Bethlehem because of the violence and fear of persecution. Jewish children under the age of 2 were going to be annihilated. That was Herod's final solution. And note, they fled back to a country. The Holy Family went back to a country where their ancestors had been enslaved for 500 years in Egypt. We are not unfamiliar with the slaughtering and abuse of children in the world news right now. Children in cages, children in refugee camps, children abandoned, school children killed in Pakistan just before Christmas, children being trafficked for sex, children having to have drills in our American schools just in case there's a shooter. Could it speak to our pain and grief and confusion about these modern day situations in our text for today? Did you hear the news story on December 11th? A group of doctors and other protesters were arrested by federal authorities in California at the border as they attempted to pressure U.S. Customs and Border Patrol to administer flu vaccines for detained migrant children. Oh, Advent is a time to settle back, to prepare, to wait. You know what? I'm done waiting. I would suggest, rather than looking and waiting and preparing, that it is time to act on the behalf of who? The behalf of Jesus and the behalf of God. Joseph, we hear in our reading in this Matthew narrative, he was warned in a dream, we are told, by some sort of angelic being, that the leader of the region was going to kill children 2 years and younger because he had understood that that was a threat to his kingdom. Call it tuition, call it an acute awareness that moms and dads of babies have. So the father takes his newborn, he takes his wife, and they flee the potential violence, and they travel 200 miles to Egypt, which in our day doesn't sound like much. You just jump in your car, or you get on a bus, or if you're in Europe, a train. This was 10 days on foot with a newborn. And as the little family survives this ordeal and this trip, and as they survive in the country of Egypt, which was the country that oppressed their ancestors for 500 years, I know they experienced grief over the children who were not saved, over the many, many children who died, perhaps some of their friends' children, back in Bethlehem and Nazareth and all over the region. So I wonder if Joseph and Mary and Jesus were warmly received in Egypt. I think it's kind of unlikely. As they and other refugees arrived to escape the mass slaughter of baby boys, their Egyptian neighbors and officials surely complained about, those people who dress differently, who observe a different religion. They worship this Yahweh, and we worship the sun god, Ra. They shop for their special hard-to-find foods because they eat kosher. They have strange holidays. They don't understand or respect our local culture. And that carpenter Joseph, he is going to take away somebody else's job. And they obviously need to learn our language. This art piece is entitled The Refugee Family. Isn't that beautiful? Now here's a painting that I purchased on 7th Avenue in Melrose. There was a name and there was a note on the back, but I never knew the story. And I did some research over the past week, and I found out that was painted by a migrant from Guatemala who, by the way, was sent back to Guatemala. And this picture remains. And what is the title of this beautiful painting? Did you hear what I hear? Over the fence. Jesus was a refugee. When are we going to finally understand the legacy of being a refugee and a newcomer to a place far from home like Egypt is something I believe that informed Jesus' teachings and life throughout his 33 years. How could it not? Because we all carry our history with us. We all carry our history with us. People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them, unless we find escape. I find it probable that these early life experiences of Jesus being a refugee, being unwanted in Egypt as a family, and he potentially was there for 2 to 3 years. They helped shape Jesus' life and ministry to the people who also were living on the margins. Those who had set aside, those who were ill, those who by race were ostracized. We see Jesus warmly accepting people from other places, from other religions and other races. He eats with them. He laughs with them. He welcomes the outsider. This is the true incarnation. When Jesus set off on his 3-year mission, he took up the life of a displaced person. Everybody hear that? He took up the life of a displaced person, which is the legal definition of how Jesus lived. He couch hopped for at least 3 years. He had no permanent home. And his disciples, essentially, he asked them to walk along the road like destitute refugees who had suddenly fled persecution. And they would now walk and rely on, as displaced persons, on the hospitality of ordinary people in ordinary cities like Phoenix, Arizona, and Payson, and Flagstaff, if they could climb the mountain. And his disciples were being asked to live like Jesus. Jesus remained forever a migrant, homeless refugee. Jesus, born in the midst of Herod's brutality, the final solution to kill all the Jewish boys. Again, an earlier Holocaust, knows the suffering of displacement, knows the suffering of the refugee, knows the suffering of the migrant, and my goodness, that means he knows our suffering too. We don't worship a God who fixes the immigration system, the broken immigration system. We worship a God, Immanuel, who walks with us in our broken immigration system and walks with us whatever state we may find ourselves in. We worship a God who visits us with dreams and visions and amazing insights. Immanuel, the God who walks with us on refugee and migrant trails just over the border in Arizona. Immanuel, the God with us and with the child in the cage. Immanuel, the God who is with the young adolescent boy or girl who is sex trafficked. In a story that is as ancient as human culture and as modern as tomorrow's news, people are fleeing tyrants who don't care if children live or die. In her book, Amazing Grace, A Vocabulary of Faith, this Christian contemporary author, Kathleen Norris, she contrasts the fear of Herod and the faith of Mary and Joseph. Everything Herod does is out of fear. Can you make the connection? Fear can be a useful defense mechanism. I use it all the time, and I know you do too. But when a person is always on the defensive like Herod, it becomes debilitating and it becomes self-defeating. To me, Herod symbolizes the terrible destruction that fearful people can leave in their wake. if they have power, but can only use it in furtive, pathetic, and futile attempts at self-preservation. In the first century, by the way, he was called the most paranoid king that ever lived. Paranoid about the possible threats to his rule. Herod actually killed his own sons, by the way, and had few qualms about killing anybody else's sons and daughters. Herod is a case study that proves the truth of this particular proverb in 29:25. The fear of others lays a snare, but the one who trusts in God rests secure. This story, this narrative of the Holy Family fleeing to Egypt, being refugees and displaced, and this story of several astrologers involved in this story who warn and who are warned themselves. This story, I think, forces us to stay real and ask ourselves the question, why do we live with such fear? Why are you and I and we living with such fear? So here's my Pollyanna way of looking at it. Fear has two meanings, F-E-A-R. Forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. Forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. And I kind of like to run, not physically. I used to run. I used to jump hurdles. Yeah, right. I'm not sure who said that, but I'm going to find out. I don't think it was Greg this time. But really, isn't the choice always ours, how we respond to situations? God is with us. I have to keep reminding myself of that during the Advent season and actually through every season of life, that God is with you, that God is with me, that God is with us, that God is the companion on the journey for absolutely everybody. In fact, God is with the secure and the insecure. God is with people who are paranoid, and God is with people who are confident. God is with the powerful, and God is with the powerless. Nobody's excluded. And honestly, that kind of sucks, because there are some people we want excluded, right? To an insecure king or president who himself exercises almost godlike power over his subjects, the son of such a God like Jesus is the ultimate threat. The king is foiled by the Magi. And then an angel going behind the king's back tells the young father, you better go. We got to save this one. Joseph's strategy to hide out and avoid Herod's killing of children is like entering some sort of first century witness protection. A question I have to ask myself is, why was Herod filled with such burning fury to destroy this child? I think because Jesus was a game changer. Jesus was somebody who was potentially going to overturn the world. Insecurity, competition, arrogance cannot survive in the same world for long with somebody like Jesus. I found that in my own life. I can't be competitive and arrogant and insecure and cruel and really be filled with Jesus. In this beautiful narrative, we see God's power prevails. The child is not destroyed as an infant, and guess what? As an adult, ultimately, this child comes back to life. Competition and threats and abuse of power is overcome by divine companionship. When God walks with us, we cannot be destroyed. When we set aside our paranoia, our self-centered fears, and we embrace Immanuel, we face the reality of an unknown future with good news that we are accompanied by a God who doesn't abandon us. Yeah, Jesus was a refugee. Let's admit it. Let's stop making it a pretty story. Jesus was constantly warning and continues to warn those of us who are his followers not to be clannish, to avoid clannish thinking, to avoid the insider and the outsider group at the expense of those outsiders. I think the famous story of the Good Samaritan, the parable, says this: Jesus calls us to embody neighborly mercy, no matter the culture, the creed, the religion of those that we are seeking to serve. What is good about the parable of the Samaritan is that it serves across all the religious and cultural hostility and brings different together. Jesus tells us to go and do likewise. Christian commitment is to serving those in need, and cannot and should not be limited to serving Christians any more than Muslims and Jews or atheists or agnostics or Buddhists or anybody religious or non-religious. The recent controversies regarding refugees and migrants and immigration is not a matter of who the president is or who's in power. Rather, it's a matter of our Christian values. What does it mean to follow a Middle Eastern, brown-skinned refugee? Our faith, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, and all the rest of the faiths, tell us that we should be turning toward refugees, not away from refugees. We should be turning toward the vulnerable parts of the world and not away from the vulnerable parts of the world, which actually includes our own vulnerable selves. This is the radical truth of Advent, and this is the radical truth and the beauty of the season of Christmas. As the season of Advent and Christmas fades in a couple of weeks, may the complex story live on in you and in me. I have no homework for you, as Susan did last week, and I need to check in where you at with your homework. But I do have two closing questions that I'd like you to plant deep within your hearts for the rest of this season. First of all is, how will you reflect Immanuel's light? Are you going to be somebody who fills backpacks with food for children? Are you going to be somebody who brings blankets for people experiencing homelessness? Are you going to be a person who cares for those family members who are outside the family system because they've had a falling out or a falling in? Are you going to be a courageous soul who supports refugees fleeing from tyrants, from despair, from lack of employment and work, and are seeking a home of safety and hope? So that's the first question. How will you reflect Immanuel's light? Second question is, will you choose to be ruled by faith or fear? How are you going to live your year out? Faith or fear? We got to get the entire Jesus story, not just the sweet, lovely, gentle baby parts. Without the difficult parts, it's only nothing more than a sweet fairy tale. Recognizing and owning the harshness of life, including the life of Jesus the refugee, gives our faith reality, gives our faith meaning, and gives our faith purpose. So how are you going to share the light? And will you commit with me to live in faith rather than fear? It is not going to be easy. You think? It's not going to be a cakewalk, a pie walk, or whatever kind of walk you want to do. Living in faith or living in fear and letting our light shine.